My name is Tracy, Wenger, and I'm a chaplain here at Elizabethtown College. I'm an ordained clergywoman in the Church of the Brethren, which is the church that founded the college. I teach also in the Religious Studies Department courses on philosophical theology, vocation, church in the 21st century, global values and leadership, life meaning and purpose work, things like that. I'm very happy to be here to moderate this panel with these three clergywomen, and that's the topic of this panel, is women in the clergy. So I would like to introduce to you, I think we'll just go in this direction. So this is Reverend Sandy L. Strauss. She joined the staff of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches as the Director of Public Advocacy in 2004. The Director of Public Advocacy is a member of the Council's executive staff, and she has responsibilities to inform, to educate, and empower people of faith on significant public issues, and to coordinate and articulate public policy positions that reflect the Council's constituent church body's commitment to peace and justice and equality and compassion for all people. Sandy received a Master of Divinity degree from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and she is an ordained minister of the Word in the Presbyterian Church USA. She has an MA in Public Policy Studies from Duke and a BA in Journalism and Music from the Lindenwood Colleges in St. Charles, Missouri. She lives in Harrisburg with her husband, David Arnold, a handyman and clockmaker who does many things, but especially miraculous things with wood. And together they have reclaimed a city property on the block behind them for his wood shop, a prolific garden, and a home for tens of thousands of bees and 6 chickens. I am also pleased to introduce to you in the center the Reverend Marcy H. Nicholas, who is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and she currently serves as pastor of Grace United Methodist Church, which is an urban and historical church in downtown Harrisburg. Reverend Nicholas is considered a second career pastor because in the first half of her professional life, she was on the faculty of Penn State York campus. There, alongside wonderful colleagues, she taught writing and literature, women's studies, and most recently, the Bible as literature. For the time being, she lives on a small farm with her artist husband in York County, 2 goats, 2 dogs, and 2 cats. And she says that she is a contemplative at heart. She works at leading a life of prayer, study, and writing, while she lives out her Christian vocation in the community with the absolute coolest congregation in the Harrisburg metro area. She values robust, authentic conversations, a creative process, intellectual curiosity, good friends, good food, physical activity, especially golf, and reading almost anything, and all of the arts. And finally, on the end, the Reverend Dr. Virginia Parkum is a Buddhist priest with the Blue Mountain Lotus Society. She leads services and meditation in Harrisburg, and she also teaches Zen arts classes in Zen ink brush painting, the ways of tea and Buddhism, Buddhism and music, and sand mandalas. She is active in interfaith work and was selected as an outstanding woman in Pennsylvania by the Pennsylvania Commission on Women. Her exhibit, As We Remember, the Holocaust and Its Aftermath in Paintings and Poems, was hung in the Holocaust Reading Room at the Penn State University, Harrisburg, through all of 2012. She co-authored The Soul Quest, Zen Lessons for the Journey of Life, and book chapters on Buddhist work in social action and in prisons. So we have a very esteemed panel with us today, and they are going to begin by sharing each of them 8 to 10 minutes of opening comments, focused on a number of questions about their thoughts and experiences as women in the clergy, and then following their opening comments, we will open it up to all of you to ask your questions to them.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say right up front, I don't have 8 to 10 minutes, and I think we all had the same understanding that we had 8 to 10 minutes for us all three to do it. So this will be short, and there'll be plenty of time for people to ask questions, I think.
Prepare your questions.
There's a lot more that could be said, obviously, but I came to ministry as a second or actually, it's probably closer to a third or fourth career, depending on how you look at the trajectory of my own working life. It isn't something that I ever would have envisioned for myself, but life's twists and turns often surprise you, and that included the death of a spouse, which of course has a way of changing some of your best laid plans. I'm coming up on my 10th anniversary of ordination in the Presbyterian Church USA in January of 2014. And I have to say that I'm really glad that the call came. All the doors opened, and I had the good sense and the wherewithal to walk through them as that happened. Now, before I speak to specific challenges, let me first say that I think being a member of the clergy in general is not easy, regardless of gender. It can also be more or less challenging depending on the tradition that you happen to reside in, or even the region that you're in. For example, I found that there are still congregations in this area that view having a woman as their pastor as less than optional. That wasn't true for the Presbyterian Church that I knew in other areas. But they are willing to settle for a woman when they can't find a man who's willing to accept the position. And the reason that men usually aren't is because it's typically part-time, low pay, longer hours than the part-time that they're getting. The good news, I think, is that many find that they really like having a female pastor once they do have one. My own anecdotal evidence comes from my experience at a church in York, where this was my first call after seminary. I was their guinea pig. They had never had a woman in leadership in this congregation, and I was there for a few months. At the end of my tenure there, 2 women, and yes, it was women, came up to me as I was leaving this interim position to say, "You may have heard that there were some people here who really didn't want a female pastor. I was one of them, and you've changed my mind." So I think that's good news for a lot of women. One challenge I had early on was that I was single. I was single when I started out, and I sensed that there were a lot of questions that were hanging in the background concerning my singleness at the time. Some of which I think are changing, and I don't know, we may get into some of that stuff later. While it's not directly related to that, of course, being a female clergy person made dating more difficult as a single person. A lot of men are scared off by that. I was fortunate that in my present call as Director of Public Advocacy at the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, I wasn't breaking new ground. My predecessor was a woman. And women have been quite active in ecumenical and interfaith circles, and in a lot of ways, fitting in there was probably a lot easier than it would have been in many congregations in my presbytery here in South Central Pennsylvania. However, women aren't universally accepted across the 20 denominations that are represented by the council either. And I have to admit that I've struggled to make really good connections with some of the traditions that we have, Orthodox traditions in particular, and some of the traditional African American denominations. And a lot of these women can't be ordained in the first place, so it's difficult sometimes to accept a woman who is ordained. I think some advantages that we have as women is that we tend to be gentler, better listeners, and less confrontational. Now that doesn't mean that we're not challenging, but I think it does mean that we're less threatening. I think women are able to speak and be heard in ways that men may not be heard. On the other hand, sometimes I think we may be taken a little less seriously than men. Sometimes men seem to receive respect just because they're men, when it may not be warranted. And women have to work harder to earn that respect. However, I also have some sense that once we've earned that respect, we experience a really good degree of loyalty and high regard because we have earned it. Personally, I'd rather earn it than lose it because it was undeserved in the first place. Now, I do think that women doing what I do may be viewed differently than a man doing it. It seems to provide one more excuse for folks in congregations who aren't thrilled with women in ministry to reject me as too radical to be a pastor in those same congregations. As to call to ministry, for those who feel that they are being called, whether male or female, I would strongly urge that you enter into a discernment process with family, friends, and congregations, colleagues, and all before jumping. It's always good to have others to validate any call that you might feel. But once that happens, I would certainly wholeheartedly encourage following a call to ministry if it comes to you. There's always going to be some tough times. There's tough times in anything that you do. But I think that they are outweighed by opportunities to do good and to share the good news and to encourage and empower others. That's
like Sandy, I am a second career pastor, as you heard Reverend Sod share with you. I taught English at Penn State York for almost 17 years. That's where I met my husband. That's where I began my professional life after coming out of graduate school. And then around 2002, I started to experience a sense of the call to go to ministry, and Sandy and I actually went to the same seminary, though not exactly at the same time. And so now I've been there in ministry as a local licensed pastor, as an ordained elder since 2008, but in ministry full-time since 2002 and 2005. I got my first full-time appointment. And so I want to be careful because where I am now, where I'm appointed now here at Grace in Harrisburg is a lot different than my first appointment. And though I suspect that my first appointment is a lot closer to what a lot of people and I mean women and men experience in ministry. I know the church where Sandy was, it was a bit larger church. I was originally at these two small churches. And how I would characterize that experience was sort of this double bind, if you will. Many congregations, when a pastor is called there, or in my case appointed, United Methodists are appointed to churches by a bishop. They certainly want all the things that every congregation wants. They want leadership, they want vision, they want direction, they want a sense of life ordered. They want great sermons. These are sort of leadership aspects of the ministry. So when you're a woman and you come into that, what I noticed happened was that they sort of then moved back into the sort of the default of, well, you're a woman, you can't be this way, so we expect you to be like a typical woman. We need you to be nurturing. You must love children. You must cry at the drop of a hat. You must be emotionally expressive. You must just visit and love people to death. So even though they wanted this sort of leadership, cohort of skills, because I was a woman, then they expected me to act like how we stereotype women. I am not like that. In fact, on many tests that test personality, I come out as much more task-oriented, much more, in fact, stereotypically masculine traits. I'm much more task-oriented. I'm more of a thinker than a feeler. I'm a planner. I like to see results. so forth and so on. So I'm up against what they think they want, but now they want me to move back and to become this very mushy female. And I am not that, unfortunately. And not to say that there's anything wrong, and I shouldn't be saying it like that, but that's not who I am in particular. So I was sort of caught in this bind where I was trying to do what they wanted me to do, and they couldn't sort of get their heads wrapped around that not all women are this way, not all people are this way. Because certainly there are some men who are nurturers and caretakers, and they couldn't quite wrap their heads around this. And in addition, you have a hierarchy that you are responsible to that wants you to be the leader, the visionary. So you're sort of caught in these two places. I would say, as far as changes in women being called into the clergy in the past decade, I think in this area, in the central Pennsylvania area, in United Methodist churches, we still have churches who have never had a woman pastor, and that it is indeed almost a cross-cultural experience for women. I told my leadership, not in my church, I told some leaders in the United Methodist Church, they're very interested in having sort of cross-cultural seminars if they appoint, say, an African-American pastor to a white church. I said, well, what are you doing about appointing women, when there's a woman appointed to a church that's never had a woman before? They said, what, there's a problem with that? They were amazed that there could still be. I said, look, you're still in an area that is much more provincial than what you realize about women in leadership. That's been my most recent experience. And at the end of my tenure at this small, I had a different experience than Sandy. A woman came up to me and I was leaving, I was going to be appointed to Grace, and she said to me, she said, listen, I really like you, but I've always preferred men to be my pastor. I mean, this church actually had several women who had been pastors before me, but she admitted to me, and she wasn't being cruel, it wasn't hurtful, it wasn't painful for me to hear, but she in fact said, well, I have to tell you, I've always preferred men in this position. And when I was in seminary, a Pew study was passed out, and it said that still, this was probably I was in seminary 2002, 2005, so around there, it was still, the study revealed that still most mainline Protestant churches prefer a male pastor who's about 35 with 2.5 kids. So I think if we're talking about women clergy, we are maybe still 20 years behind. Even the statistics that Cheryl Sandberg presents, though in seminary about half of the seminarians are women. So where are they going to get placed in some of these small congregations where they're going to experience this pushback? And it's rough. I will tell you, I had a very rough first experience, but my experience at Grace is completely different, and that's because of the congregation. We have a lot of professional people there who have worked with women in all sorts of positions, and so it's not even an issue for them where I am now.
Please let me know if you can't hear me. My voice is fading a little. I spent 7 hours with a sick horse and her owner, and the horse and owner are doing well, but my voice isn't. This has been a Buddhist for about 14 years, ordained minister for about 10 of those, and I'd say this is probably about the 10th career happening, or truly answering the last note, the real calling. And my mom said, mom was 101 years old in a nursing home. She told me the other day, you keep choosing these things that get less and less income, and there's wrong with your income, so I hope you're happy. And actually, I am, but not for that reason. Buddhism in the West is really at the frontier of Buddhism in general as a worldwide religion. It's at the frontier of its really revitalization and rejuvenation, and women are at the front and the frontier of Buddhism in the West, and it's a very, very exciting time to be what I am. Buddhism itself, I'll give you a little like Buddhism on the size of a trading card of background, because you might not be as familiar with it. As a tradition, it's always offered the teachings of liberation, both personal and from suffering, but also for the 2,500 years it's been around, it's been bounded by the norms of the cultures in which it's grown up, first the Asian cultures, and now hitting the Western and the American cultures. The most basic teaching to me was your true nature is good and pure. It's the sun, like the sun shining in the sky. The clouds are only temporary. And to me, that was my wake-up teaching, because I'd always been feeling, no, my true nature isn't good and pure. There was sin, this, that, and the other. And however things were taught to me, it wasn't relating. Just that idea of original okayness was great. But as I say, over the years, this is a little bit covered up in the thousands of years of growth. And the original Buddhist community way back in northern India, area near Nepal, had women in it. They were it was open to men and women from all social levels, all economic status, and that both having that economic part open to everybody was very revolutionary at the time. And certainly having women being in a community was super revolutionary. Some of the earliest writings, the songs of the early Buddhist women, they're amazing to read, simply amazing. And also amazing that they've been pretty much lost for about 2,400 years. And I'll sort of bounce back and forth with some of these things. But as it's growing from a tradition that was both mentally and socially liberating, it grew into a tradition dominated by patriarchy and women, where are you? The Blue Mountain Lotus Society of the Buddhist group, and Buddhism is diverse as pretty much say Christianity and Judaism as if taken together. There's so many different traditions and branches within Buddhism that some of what I say is very much more pertinent to some than others, but question and answer it, yes, or ask me for references, be happy to give, or email me, be happy to provide good background references. My tradition of Blue Mountain Lotus Society is about 15 years old, as far as it started about 1 year before I joined, but it's Buddhism that's brought all the, of course, the traditional teachings, but in a contemporary voice, and we've developed our own liturgies, our own way of presenting the teachings, which any Buddhist anywhere could walk in and feel totally comfortable with, but also anyone who's never heard beings about Buddhism, except maybe something on a kung fu movie, can also be totally comfortable with and
A
understand.
little bit closer, I think, just close to your mouth as you can. Yeah. No, closer to you, to your mouth. Okay, there you go.
Okay, try again. I hope if you're missing something,
No.
maybe it'll be rerun tonight at 11. I don't know. But we're not tied to any of a temple or a tradition, Asian or any of the American temples, which is bad financially, but great for developing our own liturgies and our own programs, which it's been a truly liberating experience in that respect too. Some of the ministers I've talked with that are from the more established Buddhist traditions, oh, man, you can do so much that we can't do. I want to do. Al Bloom in the Shin temple and major Shin Buddhist temple in Hawaii said, there's so much I want to do with our group, and I can't, because we can't do it because so-and-so, and the hierarchy in Japan says we can't, it has to be this way. So again, I'm experiencing this from the third generation of contemporary Buddhist teachers, saying Buddhism really took off in America in the 50s, 60s. So I'm the third generation, and I'm really enjoying the changes that I've been afforded, I think, because of that. And also a second generation feminist, which has also brought in interesting things, because Buddhism in America grew up with the second generation of feminists, and you've experienced probably your own faith traditions with Mary Daly, Christianity, and Katie Cannon's the African American Christian traditions, Judith Placzko, Judaism, to find out people who have developed feminist ideas within their own traditions and written extensively about the problems that women in their traditions have had and were having. And Buddhism pretty much parallels that. Buddhism got a big boost in the 1800s from the Transcendentalists, Thoreau, Emerson, and Margaret Fuller. So America was sort of a little bit ripe for listening to what the Buddhist teachings might have to offer. The Tibetan, the occupation or liberation, however you view it, of Tibet by the Chinese government, led to many Tibetan teachers coming to the West. So there's been that big growth spurt of Tibetan style Buddhism also. Buddhism, again, I say we share similar concerns with the women's development in other faith traditions. And I think one of them that I've certainly experienced was the development of constructing a feminist or a feminine liturgy, bringing women back into a tradition that, speaking Buddhism, that they had been there, but they disappeared. And I don't have many, well, I do now, but when I started out studying, or when people 20, 30 years ago started studying, where were Buddhists, women in Buddhism in different cultures? One example is in the Zen tradition, you chant your ancestry, going back to the Buddha, and then up through teachers in your particular tradition that have been prominent. And in Japan, hundreds of years, thousands of years, no women, certainly China not. Oh, there were women, but they were in liturgies. And then that became something that women teachers in America and a number of men teachers were concerned about, and developing the liturgy chant that included women. And the one we developed for Blue Mountain included the Buddha's mother, which, getting technically into theology, she was also interestingly regarded as the mother of all the Buddhas in the wisdom sutras, the wisdom writings, which concern one branch of Buddhism. But so that that tradition theoretically took the women image, the woman archetype, back to wisdom, not compassion, but wisdom. So if you lean back and then start reading all these endless sutras, all Buddhism is not a religion of the book, it's a religion of countless books to read and think about. And women in this tradition and in our tradition are seen as sort of the root of compassion, wisdom. And that's interesting. I like that. But again, you don't hear it unless you happen to study. Oh my God, the mother of all Buddhas, meaning your true nature is woman and it's wisdom. Pretty cool. But anyway, that's something that we've honored in our liturgy when reading through the teachers, the Mahaprajapati, Queen by Day for the Shin Buddhists, and different Margaret Fuller, right? Transcendentalists, Ruth Fuller Suzuki, Maureen Stewart, Ruth Faber, different people, and they don't mean anything to you, but they're wonderful women teachers who are acknowledging when we chant every service our liturgy. The Shin Buddhists, who are the most Japanese Americans are Shin Buddhists, not Zen. And the Shinbuddhist liturgy is interesting. I was in a temple in Hawaii, and they chant 20, not all Buddhists sit meditation, many Buddhists chant meditation instead, and the Shin Buddhists will chant meditation. They chant for 20 minutes, this wonderful chant, and then it's traditional, they'll also chant a poem by the founder of Shin Buddhism, Shinran, and she's written lots and lots of poems, Wasan, and each day they'll chant a different one in the cycle and then start again. So I'm sitting in the essentially church, because their churches are modeled after the Protestant churches in Hawaii, so it's like you go in and sit in regular service. So we're chanting, and then comes the poem. So profound is the compassion that manifesting inconceivable Buddha wisdom, the Buddha established the vow of transformation into men, thereby enabling all women to attain Buddhahood. Wow. Okay, I have to transform into a man, and then I can become Buddha. My true nature will be reestablished, will come out from behind the clouds that have obscured it. And that, of course, was very liberating in Japan in 1200 when it was written, but it doesn't say much for women today. And it was interesting, I discussed with the Shin ministers, the women and the men in the temple, why this was chanted, and they're very, very heavy in tradition. And then it gives them a discussion point to discuss how things have changed over the hundreds of years. But for our liturgy at Blue Mountain, that's something we would not chant anymore. But if you go to the Shin temples, you will be chanting that. So it's a little, it's being aware in liturgy where women have come from and where they are. The place where I think women have been just also taken off revolutionary in Buddhism is the number of ministers that now certainly the Zen tradition and many of the other traditions in the West are women. And that was not the case at all in the Eastern countries or when Buddhism first developed in this country. It's really exciting, both as women teachers and Zen it was traditionally male teachers, although there are a few key women throughout history that have been rediscovered that we now have heroes or heroines to claim and relate to. The Blue Mountain, number of our ordination students are women, and two of them have set up their own centers now, one in Carlisle and one in Camp Hill. And that's just, it's very heartening, and that's reflected throughout the country, the number of women that are now both teachers and heads of their own centers. One place that there have been difficulties, and I know that it's the same, I think, for any of the faith traditions, certainly, well, the Presbyterian tradition from which I came had incidences throughout the relation between students and teachers, given a man student, female teacher, and the sexual relations, and the Zen, especially in the 80s and the 60s and the 80s, there were several scandals that male teachers were having relations with women, and it's certainly not endemic only to Buddhism, and certainly not only to Zen. But the teacher-student relationship in Zen training is very, very important and very close to the study that you do with your teacher. And it sets up the scenario for male-female relations, problems, whatever, to develop. And there have been major discussions about that, and now some groups have very strict policies on dating, on having any kind of relationship with your students, either male or female. And there's still much to be made on that, but it's one of the things that is very, very verbal in our tradition, because it has been brought out as an issue. What I've personally experienced was fortunately not that, but just as any of us have the problems if the leader of your group is, or the just male power relationships. And a number of the women that I've talked to who are ministers will have the same thing. Well, notice the guy is in charge, and the woman, she will get to do publicity, or we get to have the role of tenzo, the cook in the Buddhist temple. It's an honored position, but it's a very honored position. In Japan, it will be the man that will do that, but over here it's often the woman that does it because women are always the cooks. So it has to be reestablished. Yeah, that's actually one of the, probably the second most, or the most important position in the temple is the cook. So, hey, thanks, that was a great choice. But I know I've always, and still it is a problem, well, all publicity, oh yeah, we can do publicity, and 10 years later, we're having publicity problems, can you still do this? And I finally said, no. But, and that's, again, it's not endemic to Buddhism at all, but you ask for the personal experiences. The teachings of liberation do not automatically liberate people from what they grew up with, what they believe in their role as man and woman. But fortunately, the teachings also help me deal with it better and work out the difficulties. But why is having a woman clergy member important? And I think it was Dr. Terry that referred to this too. But I think it's very important for women to have a clergy member that they can refer to because of the experiences they may have had with abuse, both physically and verbally. And I think it's vital that a woman be available in the clergy in a power position that they can relate to, as open and as good as many men clergy are, but just needing a safe space. And of course, there's always instances where maybe it isn't safe, but needing what is in general can be perceived as a safe space to go to, someone to talk with, and that will have the wisdom and compassion of having possibly a shared experience, or certainly knowing people that had that experience, but often a shared experience, because so many of us have suffered some kind of abuse. And the need to know that won't happen when you're studying with this person or in a pastoral relationship is awfully important. And it's also important for men in the congregation and in the clergy to have the experience of working with women, which many haven't had, especially in an authority position or any kind of an equal relationship. And again, I like the wisdom archetype, and I'm glad to have that and had a chance to talk a little bit about it with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I would be happy to open to conversations or questions from the floor. Yes?
I've said before, I don't know if you ladies were here, I'm only 26, and I'm from Danville, Pennsylvania, so it's a very, very small community. I was born and raised in the same Lutheran church my entire life. And Lutheranism, for those that don't know, is an offshoot of Catholicism. So it's a very rigid religion, and it's very Catholic-based. And so growing up in the church, I did not ever know that women could be ministers. I had no experience with any other faiths. I had no experience with any other, religious systems or anything like that. I just thought that's men do that, And it was very hard for me and very interesting for me because while some people would generally think of their minister as a confidant, and someone that they could go to and speak to, I never really felt that way about my minister. I looked at him as a teacher and an educator from a religious aspect, to learn the traditions and things of my religion, the history of it, and things like that. But I never had that relationship. And it wasn't until I hit high school that we had an intern from a seminary who was a woman, and she was working on her ordination. And I remember I was like, oh wow, like, who is this person? Because up until then, my whole entire life, it was just our minister. He mentioned she was going for ordination. And that just opened a whole other door for me. Previously I had been in the choir, I had been an acolyte, which is also something in Catholic Church that generally that men do. We had an older gentleman who would lay minister, because to pay a minister to travel from, I think it was Gettysburg Seminary up to Central PA was very expensive. And he had cataracts and couldn't read the liturgy anymore. And I was the oldest and sort of the youngest still capable to do that. And I had been part of the service for so long. I actually took over that lay ministry for our congregation. When I left for the military, I kind of felt bad because there weren't a lot of younger women that had that experience, that knew, that women are out there. So I guess my question is, for kids like me, in these regions where that's almost unheard of, or in these religions where that's almost unheard of, how do we get that out there? How do we connect young girls, young women with, women mentorship in leadership in religion, so that they know that that avenue is out there for them, so that, because kids dream all the time, you ask my son, what do you want to be when you grow up? Today it's a fireman, tomorrow it's an astronaut, but, young girls don't look at that and say, I'll be a minister, I'll be a leader like that. They don't have these relationships. How do we put that into the community?
That's a great question, and I think what you experienced growing up is in some ways very typical, of course, where you didn't see another face, you saw the face of this male pastor. In other ways, it's very typical. It's atypical, because now usually we find that women are given these sort of small rural churches, and the boys are given the big steeple churches, or they're given churches closer to towns, or they're given, for instance, in the United Methodist Church, we have a lot of churches that are on, if you can believe this, what are called 5-point and 7-point charges. There are 5 churches that a pastor may be responsible for.
My minister has 3.
Yes,
Well, there's a lot of problems, but yeah, he 3 churches.
Right. So a lot of the guys get single-point charges, and the women get these. Though I won't say that's always the case. And how do you do that in a small community? I think one thing, and I don't have any quick answer to this, there's no quick fix to this. I think that you have to start encouraging the women in your congregation to be leaders of committees, not just on the committee, not just on, committees like the hospitality committee, but on all sorts of committees. And I think, people have got to be willing to take a chance and say, how can we talk about, can we get women here to talk to us? Can we, in your case, if you felt like you needed to talk to a pastor who was a woman, can you go to your pastor and say, listen, I'd like to talk to a woman pastor. Do you know of any woman pastor that I can talk to? That's a tough question.
And I think a lot of people are somewhat intimidated to do that too, though. I was raised with this minister my entire life, so I kind of felt like, oh, well, if I do that, am I insulting him by saying, I don't trust you, I don't want to talk to you, you've known me my whole life,
right?
But sorry,
Or maybe ask him to start to communicate about seminaries and show some of these pictures, shows, that here are seminaries where women make up over sometimes half the population in seminaries. It's like it's 60-40 now in some places.
I would add that it's worth looking to, most of the church bodies, the higher up bodies, have lists of congregations and ministers there. So, and you said you come out of the Lutheran tradition. If you were to go to the Synod website there's a lot of, listings. You could find women, I think, to talk to. Certainly coming to a local ministerium or an ecumenical body where you might find other women who might be able to help introduce you to women in your tradition. I know some incredible women pastors in the ELCA.
Yeah.
And so, just finding those people, and I know it's tough in a small area sometimes, but it just takes a little research. And I know most of those women would be more than happy to connect and help you to explore that in those areas. Some maybe less threatening. I can tell you the Reverend Amy Ruman. I don't know if you know her name at all, if anyone here does, but she's the head of the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry Office here in Pennsylvania, so she's not specifically connected with a congregation, and so that kind of thing may be less threatening to a pastor. It's tough to go to your pastor and say, I'm really not comfortable talking to you. Right. But going, there are avenues out there, and I think it's just, it takes a little exploration, but it's well worth the time to do it. And there's lots of women out there who are willing to.
I'd like to add to the question, because that's what I'm hearing is that you were not exposed or knew of the opportunity that this could be available to women. And one of the things that's going on in a number of communities is that they're having opportunities through the YMCAs across the country through youth achievement programs, and they expose specifically middle school and high school students to various people in their communities in certain professions, and to have them kind of mentor them and have them appreciate and see what sort of paths they may have to look at and consider. Now, I have to admit, I've never seen a path that really talked about women in ministry, which I think could be something that they could consider think about, is having that opportunity to have them involved, and then those young women to see, men as well. They may have interest and be a participant in that. Years ago, I know in Harrisburg High School, it was around this time of the year, and they would bring various professional people into the school, and they would do something similar, and they would have students have access and have the opportunity to talk with those folks to see of the non-traditional occupations, other avenues that young people could consider for various different thinking on higher education and what they may want to pursue. So that type of thing needs to be looked at and see how we can get a job.
What was that called? Youth?
It's called Youth Achievers, and it's through the, across our country through the YMCAs, okay? In Harrisburg, the Camp Curtin YMCA in Harrisburg has that program. And it's something, again, they're looking for professionals that will give up. It's used 2 Saturdays a month, like the first, third Saturday, and have opportunities, spend a half a day, and they can work in these breakout groups, and we get to learn and know more about that particular profession, occupation, and get some sense of something they may have some interest in.
So are you still connected with that community? I mean, is that?
I am. I actually moved back there, and I have 2 young boys, that I raised. And so I was just wondering, like I said, for the younger generations,
And here's you could take the lead on this.
Right.
We want you to be the leader in pursuing that.
And I think, I'm sorry, I have a lot of ideas, and I think my idea that I'm having now is to sort of maybe do like an open house and have, like some of you ladies there, and, invite, open it up to the communities to bring their daughters and bring these young girls and say, look, this is something you can do, and to present these opportunities without maybe affronting existing ministers in the area, to just say, here it is, come and experience it,
I understand. I came out of the Roman Catholic tradition myself, and I came out in the, I was born in the 50s, so, that period where women could do nothing except become nuns and kind of teach, There's some really cool nuns out there now, but they still can't be priests, but unfortunately, but they're very upfront, God love them. And, I understand coming out of that tradition, and it took me a long time to break out of that, feeling like, as a woman, hey, this is something that we can do, especially if it's been kind of drilled into you from the time you were very young.
I'd like to, go ahead.
I was just thinking, as she was talking, in the African American tradition, ministers are called. It's not an avocation that they have chosen. So I wanted to know what was your feeling as the call to the ministry and being just choosing to be in the ministry.
Well, it's not exactly the same. I think that, at least for me, the sense of call came from being in a congregation where I was not going to be called to be the pastor in the same way that someone might be called in an African American congregation to be the pastor, but being called upon to do a lot more teaching, to be a deacon, to be in leadership in various ways. And then someone finally coming to me and saying, I really think you're being called to ministry. It wasn't something that hit me. I laughed when I heard that. That was like, me? That can't be. But I do think, and I mentioned this earlier about the sense of call and discernment, which I think is really important. There needs to be that kind of confirmation of call within a congregation. And I don't know, Marcy's experience may be different, Virginia's may be different, but it was, I think, similar in the sense that there were people there who said, we think that you belong there. And then it's a matter of, but at least in the Presbyterian Church, you must complete a degree and then be able to go through all kinds of testing and stuff first before you can actually be called to a congregation. And every system is different, but I think there's a similar piece, which is having a group, whether it's a congregation or whatever, helping you to recognize.
Point of correction, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the call that Vernon's referring to is the call by God.
Oh.
The conviction in you that you are being led
Sorry,
to this. Yeah.
Okay.
Because you'll never get called.
And I was saying that I'm speaking of the call from God as opposed to the call from man.
Right.
And in the African American tradition, our churches are now becoming that the pastors are being educated. My husband having his evening from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. So, basically that's what I was talking about. A lot of people think that you're being called by people. I mean, the call from God, that He wants you to be that minister in that church, whether you are the pastor or not.
I think what's, and we talk about the call too in the United Methodist tradition. I think the call, through the power of the Holy Spirit, God gives you these people who uses these people to sort of to affirm and confirm your call. That they come forward, I think, by the grace of God, to address you and say, hey, we think you might be called to ministry. So there is the external, I guess Calvin talks about this, right? The external call and the internal call. And for me, I felt, there was a time in my 20s when I actually pursued the call, but I let it go. One, because of what she said. I didn't see, I said, go to seminary. I knew no woman who was in seminary or headed out to be a pastor. That was in, the early 80s, mid 80s. And then later on, I started to remember some of that experience, and I just felt that I was being sort of led in this direction. by God. Though I will also say, I think there's a lot of mythology connected around the call too. I think we have to be very careful that we're not, is this call about my ego, or is this about God? And that can get you in a lot of trouble. And I think there's also, for me, I'm learning that there's also this piece of living into the call. That the call is not just a one-time experience. That in fact, I'm still figuring out and still discovering this call that has been placed upon me by God and by people who have come forth, I believe, from God to affirm this. By my, I think there's a living into the call too.
I do think that in terms of being called by God, I think, and maybe putting it in just very simple terms, God sometimes speaks through others. And I can tell you, actually, when I was in seminary, there were a couple of people who basically kind of said, yeah, God whispered in my ear that he wanted me to be in ministry. And I would say, beware. I think it needs to come from both sides.
Yeah.
In other words, you need to feel that, and sometimes someone else may have a sense that you're being called before you realize that God's calling you to that, if that makes any sense at all. I think the two, and I think that's really what I meant by that whole discernment idea, is that you really need those two things together to make it work.
I think with Buddhism, so it reflects what I had said before, that now in the West, that a woman who feels called to and being a non-theistic tradition, didn't say God, but the ground being whatever non-specific term, being called to serve in that way is possible. Whereas in Japan, in the Zen temple, you're the oldest son, you inherit the temple, you go to the next temple, you go for training for a while at another temple and get permission to teach. In Japan, several of the new Buddhist religions are led by women who were inspired and felt, from their perspective, the calling, but it was not available to be answered within an established tradition, so they've founded their own variety of the faith, of the Buddhist tradition. So yes, again, in the West, it's more possible to feel the call and act on it.
Thank you. We have a question.
Question and comment. I just realized today I have a call to question patriarchy. It's been my call my whole life. Just a comment about your reluctance to question the patriarchal structure of Christian clergy. A desire that everyone put that reluctance into perspective for women in the Muslim world, because it's the same kind of patriarchal systems we're working against. And it's present everywhere. You dance with a dissident daughter, and I'm one of those dissident daughters. It's in the Southern Baptist tradition. It's pervasive, and so we're all in the same boat. We're more alike than we are different in whatever religion we're discussing. But I had a question for Dr. Parkum. If there were to be a female prophet, if she would agree to, I would think Karen Armstrong would be who I would follow.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know her, and they asked her, for her form of freelance monotheism sort of attracts me intellectually. What is your opinion about her book on the Buddha, and would you recommend it as a reference for someone wanting to study more? I've read some of her other books, but I haven't read that one.
It's been a while back since I read it, and I liked it at the time, and I think I would again because I liked her other writings. I just have to remember what I thought. I thought at the end that she saw him seeing that he was failing. There was some sort of this was falling apart, that was falling apart. And I didn't, when I look at the Buddhist history, and even at the time, I didn't see it so much as that. that it wasn't, a lot of great things had been established. He didn't set it up to establish a religion as such, but just to provide the opportunity for those teachings to be taught. And I think when the stories, I mean, maybe Buddha might not ever have existed as a person. He probably did, and the stories is what we look at. But the story of his telling his followers to go teach and all that, it didn't, to me, have that much of it as a sort of a failure, negative, as she had put. But that's sort of a minor thing. But I think, yes, definitely, I think that's a book I would refer to.
I have two quick questions. One, I'd like to hear from this young pastor, what her experience, how did she get led? You know, because you're the newer generation. So what were the role models that allowed you to enter the ministry or the clergy? And then, you know, now being part of a non-denominational church, I understand the benefits and the disadvantages of being with a church that does not have to answer to anyone for your theology. But it sounds like that's what the Blue Mountain Lotus is. It's kind of off on its own, it doesn't have to answer to anyone. So the question is then, how do you make sure you're adhering to the orthodoxy or to the belief system and how the traditional Buddhists view you? And it sounds like you're enlightened here with regard to women, but how is that transferred in traditional Buddhism? Are they enlightened with regard to women's rights and women's role in the clergy? Okay, so that's a lot.
Well, traditional Buddhist groups are so different depending what countries you're in. The Buddhist women in Thailand, the nuns are having a very difficult time being recognized as being able to be fully ordained because of some technicality. To them it's not. It's to the male, the monks, it's very important. But there was some time, thousands of years ago, a break in the lineage, so technically women can't be fully ordained because there wasn't a person that carried on the teachings person to person up until the present who was a woman. And this has gone to the Thai Parliament. It's fought in the Parliament. It's fought probably between the different monks. Some are very supportive of the women, some are not. And they're asking if they receive ordination from a Tibetan Buddhist lineage, will that be accepted because it's but so in some places it's very technical and very not liberated, and then in some it is. In Buddhist teaching, there isn't really an orthodoxy as such with Buddhism. There are some sort of core teachings, but even one of the core teachings was that these teachings, the Buddha said to us, if these teachings don't work, if this particular teaching doesn't work, forget about it, try something else. And we're both remembering it, and there's always the precepts, the four noble truths. There's some very core things in core writings, and you'd be able to tell if it's not that, and it's not the psychological principles that over the thousands of years developed from those, if they're not reflective of that. And it's not liberating. Basically, if the teaching is not liberating for you, it's not authentic, and that's the way that. And if you're in the Shin Buddhist tradition, say they have their own seminaries. They're probably the best trained Buddhist ministers of all, because of the program that they have that you have to go through to be a Shin Buddhist minister. And they might have particular things that they're not teaching something or other than according to Shinran. But again, it's not really quite the same. Certainly for Blue Mountain it isn't, which, as I said, is why some of the traditional ministers envy us so much. Even for developing our lineage with 5 women in it, hooray, but they don't if it goes back to a traditional temple that doesn't have it.
So my answer to your question is, I wish that I were as young as I think you are. And what I would say, I was raised in Lancaster County, in the southern end of the county, in a place called Bubba. And so those of you who live in Lancaster County know what that means, across roads with a tractor pull and a turkey go. I was part of a very large, extremely rural and conservative church on Sunday mornings. So we had 5 people. And my grandmother, whose father was a free minister at one of the most conservative churches in this district, did nearly everything in the church possible except to become ordained in my church where I grew up. And she church to always welcome visitors, and she has a call to lay ministry. We had a pastor there who was there for probably 15 or 18 years, and he brought female seminary students to be interns in the congregation. So from the time I was probably, this goes back to your question, from the time I was 6 years old, I saw women doing. So I like your ideas of the YFW Day and the Council of Six, and I think you've really challenged me to think about how to get the word out. But I do think my own experience in all the years in my two congregations and in here, I think there's something about women being seen, leading the liturgy, doing the, that we can say that we're clergy, but until people actually see us doing those things. I have a sister-in-law who's a pediatrician, same thing. She talks about sometimes that people need to see her being a doctor. I don't know what you all remember that, but yeah. So yeah, I think that I saw in this very rural and conservative congregation women seminary interns doing these things, and I thought, I can do that. And slowly the congregation, thought, oh, women can do that. So I hope that answers your question. I want to say just one other thing back to your question. So when I'm having a really bad day here at the college, I think to myself, if the college student population echoes the demographics of the American religious population, which I know because I have the figures, it pretty much does, I can minister to about 18. Don't fire me. No. But the population of students, there's only about 18 to 20% of them. If you 25% from Catholic, 25% evangelical Christianity, even the traditions of Judaism. When I talk to rabbis, the percentage that can be women that carry rabbis in certain traditions is very low. So yeah, I can only on any given day truly minister to 18 to 20%. Right, that can be really on a bad day. I think about that. But, and then when I'm having a good day, I think, just by existing, yes. I am an education. I think, to like 80 to 82% of the students, just by me existing, saying a public prayer, teaching class, I am an education, and you multiply that by 1,800 students passing through here. I've been here 11 years, over years. I don't know. I hope that is making. But I do think your challenge is very real. So I didn't have mentors really. I mean, I saw those interns, but I didn't have mentors. One of the questions I had for you was, have you had mentors? Where do you get support now? But I'll put that on hold because we have another question.
I was only going to inject that as an Episcopalian, and I would be remiss with Bishop Baxter, not advocating for this. There is a liaison between the Lutheran Church and the Episcopal Church. Anglicans, perhaps not so much, but as an Episcopalian, our bishop is in New York and is a woman. So as a child, again, sort of that choir, winking it as acolytes, but now certainly that opportunity as an Episcopalian for many women, and you probably know through the Harrisburg area, we have, I believe, a very, very strong presence as women within our church.
Okay, question from that?
Knowing that you probably didn't get in this for the money, I was just wondering, do women in the clergy make less than men do? And is that a function of being put in smaller rural churches that you don't make as much? Question number one. Question number two is, do you have more women in your congregations because you're a woman pastor or a woman?
Let me say something about salary. I resigned at Penn State in 2002, and I was not making 60 grand there, mind you. It was under $45,000. Actually about closer to under 45,000. Since then, it's taken me 11 years to get back to that salary. It's taken me 11 years to get back to that salary. I'm making a little bit more now than when I left Penn State, but that's how long it's taken me to get to my salary. in the United Methodist Church, in all of our conferences, there are salary levels based on number of years. So there's a minimum salary base, and churches are only required to pay that minimum salary. And so, yes, I think it is a function sometimes of where you're placed. Sometimes if you're in the United Methodist Church, you are appointed. So you can actually lose money depending on where you're appointed the next time. Because if you have a church that maybe is paying you more above your base salary, and then you go to a church that can't pay that much, you're going to lose money. And so I do think that women do make less than the male clergy, and also that's also what happens to smaller churches too, because sometimes it's not a matter of gifts and talents where you're placed. It's a matter of, well, this person is going up the ladder, so we've got to put this person at a place where they're going to make a better salary. And there's a whole, I don't want to limit it to that. There's a whole lot of things that happen in the appointment system besides salary decisions. But I would say that typically, I don't think women do make as much as men. It also depends on the geographical region. When I was in Oklahoma at a seminar on worship, I found out that their base salary is actually higher than Central Pennsylvania's base salary. I also know that in the Delaware Peninsula Conference, their base minimum salary is lower than our salary, a lot lower. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, so you're expecting seminarians, who have debt to come out and live on like $29,000 a year. That might be a starting salary in the United Methodist Church, 25 to 30 grand a year.
And this is not a 40-hour-a-week job.
Right, yeah.
I mean, you don't go to the office at 9 o'clock and leave at 5. It's
Right.
very different.
Yeah.
I would add to that by saying in my early years, in my first congregation, I would sometimes keep track of my hours, and I would divide my weekly salary by my hours. I don't know if you've ever done that, but there were weeks I made $3.75 an hour.
Which is less than minimum.
I should make that. Exactly.
I guess I want to stir up our dialogue.
Good.
And one of the things I want to ask our panelists, I'm not sure who might want to answer this, but you brought up salary. And it's very interesting to me, also being in ministry, and having my doctorate actually is not in medicine, but it's in ministry. And when I think about Minister Edmonds brought up the question about our calling. So I'll just start with the African American experience. Many churches, and this is a question I have, we're so prescriptive in following God's word, but not on everything. So my question is, if we really believe God's word, and we are so prescriptive, particularly in the African American church, we're very prescriptive about that calling coming from God. But yet in the African American experience, we probably have the lowest salaries for our pastors.
Right.
I remember becoming a member of a church in this region where the musician was paid more than the pastor. And I was instrumental in bringing that to the group and reminding the church of the scriptures as it relates to workman is worthy of his hire. And how when we bless the pastor, we're blessing ourselves. And how we give, and the Lord gives back to us, looking in Luke. But yet as churches, we don't follow all of those principles. And why is it that our pastors are not cared for by the church in the manner in which the Old Testament was set up, that a tithe went back to, back in the Old Testament, the churches, the pastors and the Levites, they lived from what was brought into the storehouse. Give and it will be given back to you. Pressed down, flowing over. So why is that?
how do we change that? How do we help the church follow all the principles of God's word and just not those that we choose to follow?
Hallelujah.
Well, I'll send you to my council of bishops and
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, and they, I don't know, that's a great question. I do know in the African American churches too, you have a lot of bivocational pastors. I mean, not only are they being pastors, but they're also working another full-time job.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't know how that's done myself. I don't know how that happens. I don't know what to say. There's a lot of things that go on with salary. I mean, it's not just, I don't know how to answer that. That's and
Maybe
also,
it doesn't have an answer.
and also, it's dependent upon, I hate to put it in those terms, and it's dependent upon that offering. We are paid by the local church. We're not paid as a group. We're paid by our local church. So if your church is not growing, if you have some older folks who still give what they gave in 1942, and some of that's understandable. Some of that's understandable. You have young families in this economy. That's a great question to put to congregations, I think.
I've actually heard, though, in terms of salary, there seems to be some sense, at least among some folks, that God has called you to do this, and that should be enough. And
Right.
so,
Right.
and so, it's okay. You should be willing, because God has called you to do this, to live with whatever that means, and that may mean a lot less money. It may mean. I had the same experience as Marcy in what I do, because it took me about 10 years to get back to what I was making before I went to seminary. And I don't know how you change that attitude. At some level, folks need to understand that, we live in a society where, there's a certain amount, there's certain things that are required just to survive. And basic housing, food, healthcare is a huge one, yeah. And so maybe that needs to be part of the discussion as well. Yes, I'm called by God, and this is a really important calling to me, but God didn't ask me to,
I know young clergy folks, several couples, with one spouse is clergy, the other spouse is not, and they have made decisions not to have children because they cannot afford to do that on that salary. Even with two of them working, they can't afford it.
We have two other people, and is yours direct?
Yeah, but it's very short.
Okay.
Just
Go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. Just to add into this here. What I was saying, about outreaching to the children, I do think it's important, that you have a calling from God. But I also think that there are probably women out there who do have that calling from God and ignore it. Like you ladies said, it took you a very long time to break out of that conservative religion that you were raised in. And I think that by outreaching to them, some may look at it as people are kind of interfering, and if they're really called, they'll do that. But I look at it as, like Ms. Gallagher said, we're trying to shorten the learning curve for women. So if we outreach to them, we're shortening and making them, tearing down those barriers so that maybe it won't take them until they're in their late 30s or 40s to realize that, that they can do that. and so they'll go to seminary earlier and will have the benefit of that sooner.
And to be formed
Right.
to have that formation experience
Right.
as a pastor
And my other real quick question is, the Lutheran faith, our ministers are not, like you said, they're not appointed. You basically go and apply to a congregation and they have to choose to accept you. But once you're accepted, you're either there until you retire,
Right.
until you pass on, or if they would remove you for some reason. And along with that, at least the churches that I've been in contact with have a parsonage, so they do provide a house, they
Yes.
provide some of your expenses and things like that. Is that universal along a lot of these religions, or is that like a Lutheran specific thing? Because when I think of like our minister, he has 3 churches that he does services for, but then he has his parsonage and things like that. So she was bringing up in terms of salary. I don't know from different faiths, like what do you all get? Is it just your salary, or do you all receive that kind of assistance and support from your congregations as well?
That varies across denominations. The United Methodist Church, for instance, does also have a parsonage system. But I would say not every church has a parsonage. In all traditions, I would say in ELCA.
Well, I can speak for the
Yeah.
Presbyterians. Presbyterians, most churches I know have sold off their parsonages.
Right.
They don't offer them anymore.
And
Now, typically they'll offer a little bit more in salary because of that. Salaries tend to be split up, and you can often choose how that split goes, so that you have your base salary and something dedicated to housing. And because we are seen as independent contractors, basically, which means we pay all of our Social Security. We don't have our employers pay that Social Security for us. So, some pay an offset for that. I mean, it really varies across the board.
Yes. In the United Methodist Church, some have parsonage. For instance, I live in my own house because my church doesn't have a parsonage. And I would not accept a position where I would have to move, because my husband is tenured at Penn State York, so.
But you do have a choice in that, because I know you were saying you're appointed to different churches.
Well, if I say no to an appointment to say move to Williamsport then I'm out of a job.
I gotcha.
So, I'm prepared to do that. We are told that we have to move. So there are pastors who move, every 4 years, every 10 years, you must move wherever. So if they can't find me an appointment without a parsonage that I can drive to in a certain amount of time, I'm out of a job.
We're nearly out of time, but we have 2 more people who wanted to get on.
Well, no, I just wanted to pretty much piggyback on what a lot has been said in reference to salaries and when it comes to pastors. When we're talking about the Old Testament, how do we get back to honoring our spiritual leaders? I think it comes down to education, period, and the intervention of the Holy Spirit. When we look at our local pastors, and then when we look at what we call our mega church pastors, and by definition, our mega churches are discerned by the number of people in the church, and normally that number is designated at 2,500. When you have a congregation of 2,500 or more, you're considered a mega church. But when you look at our mega church pastors, and they're driving the luxury cars, and they have the jets, and it deters us from wanting to pay that 10%. And what my question was going to be, we don't have time now, but my question earlier was going to be if you ladies would be able to speak on the business of ministry. Because I think we often forget that our leaders are not just praying for us. They're not just visiting hospitals and visiting prisons, but that they have families, and that we need to support them and their families. Now, if their ministry, especially those mega churches, those pastors started out as evangelists. They did not have a physical planted church. They went around from church to church across the nation. In a marketing type of way, they began to have a following. So it made it easier for them to grow into these bigger churches. And I don't think the media portrays them in that light. They don't tell the story of how they started. They just tell the story of where they are now, and they, if not scrutinize them, but they almost villainize them for simply doing what they were called to do, which is share the gospel. So I think what it comes down to when it goes back, and we're talking about going back to the Old Testament, it just comes down to educating the younger generation to say that this is what God requires. You don't look at man, you don't look at your pastor in the flesh form, but you do what God says, and you give that 10%, and then you let God judge that pastor as to what he does with that 10%. So I mean, I'm just grateful, for you as women being in the ministry, saying that I'm going to step to this call, regardless of what the salary is going to be, regardless if I have those benefits or not. And you still do the service and you provide the service to your congregation, and you do it with so much diligence and so much heart. So I appreciate it for you being here today. And one final question?
Well, I just want to say you need these women on your personnel committee.
Right.
On the case. But I think I was curious, and this might end, my last question last time was to sort of end on a happy note, but I do wonder, I think Tracy and I have had this conversation, that sometimes traditionally male vocations and callings or occupations, whatever, have a status of authority. And it's interesting, as more women find their way into it, sometimes those occupations and vocations actually lose their status in terms of influence.
Yes.
Now, I know in the American religious phenomena right now with all these mega churches and non-denominations, the story is more complicated. But when I look at mainline Protestant traditions, as more women find their way into leadership there, I just feel, are we losing, is that position losing authority? And you could say the same thing in terms of college professors. As more women have found their way, do college professors have that standing? So it's just have you thought about that, or, is that an accurate perception? Is that a concern we should have? How do women who get into those roles make sure that those occupations continue to have influence, even in a society that generally does not think that women have authority or the right to have authority? Tracy, you're going to help with that.
Well, I would say this. We have affiliate ministry and increased staff from a variety of denominations here. And my first couple of years here, people called me Tracy. The students, in fact, and the staff, and they called the male clergy reverend or father. And so I don't know. That's just that's all I got right now.
I wonder if there's a combination of things going on. One is that I don't know that ministry has ever been as highly paid as some other things that men have done. And as there have been opportunities in other areas for men to move on to positions where they make a lot more, women have kind of filled the vacuum. And then, there's the lower salaries to begin with. I'm not saying this very well, but there may be a whole convergence of things going on there.
I'm going to have to cut us off because we have to figure this